Right, ninth graders. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about measurement and density. And we're just starting chapter 6. So if you need to come back and watch these, again, just maybe for some extra clarification, maybe for some studying, this is always a place that you can refer back to. So just an overview of this unit. First thing is we're going to talk about the SI system, a little bit about what it is, as well as looking at the metric system. Then we're going to dive into some conversions. We're primarily going to learn two things. We're going to learn dimensional analysis as well as our stair-step method. Then we're going to look at volume and mass and how to measure volume using some different lab techniques. And then in density, how do we find density using some lab techniques as well as calculations. So first things first is we're going to dive into the SI system and the metric review. First things first is when we say SI, all we mean is the metric system. And another word or another name for the metric system is the International System of Units, otherwise known as SI. And there are three primary reasons as to why we use the metric system. The first is that it's based on the powers of 10. And so I'll have a scale here for you in just a minute. It's also easy to convert because it's in powers of 10, and scientists use it. So in other words, we're going to use it too because we're going to be scientists in this class, performing lots of labs and learning a bunch of different techniques. And so common prefixes, or just a reminder, a prefix is a word, letter, or number that comes before another. And here they are. So the prefixes, the first is kilo, then we have hecto, deca, then there's our base, then we have deci, centi, and milli. In order to convert between the metric system, it is crucial that we know this information here. Okay? And primarily, what's really important is this kilo. Our prefix is K, or the symbol is K, and our value for kilo is 1,000. Same thing here. Hecto is 100, deca is 10, base is 1. Now, the base is interesting because we have different measurements here. We're going to talk about them here in a couple slides. But L stands for liters. M is L is liters, M is meters, G is grams, and S is seconds. Okay? And then we go down, we have deci, which is D or DC. Notice how there are two different Ds here. Okay, we either are going to say DA or DK for deca. In deci, we're going to say D or DC. The value is 0.1. Centi is just C, it's 0.01. And then milli is M and 0.001. So notice these are by the power of 10. That's super, super important. If we understand that, we're in a good spot. Okay? So, looking a little bit deeper, when we say the different symbols in units, like if I were to be measuring a length, the unit symbol that I'm going to use is meters, which is M. Again, that's at our base. So if we were to go back for just a second, for measuring a distance, we'd measure in length, right? And we're going to use meters or M. Okay. Then, if we're taking a mass, we're going to be measuring in kilograms. That's kind of the standard, but for us, it's mostly going to be in grams. Time is in seconds, so that's what the S stands for. And then temperature is in Kelvin. Okay. Now, just a quick note, anytime you hear the word derived unit, this is when you combine one or more SI units. So, for example, density, which we'll talk about in the second half of this chapter, is mass and volume. So again, you have a mass and you have a volume. Okay, so if we combine two or more of those together and we see that in our units, that's called a derived unit. Matter is anything that takes up space and has a mass. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And that's just a picture of density for you. Okay, we're going to this is just a very quick sneak peek of what we're going to talk about later in this unit. So just some discussion questions. In science, we measure large and small quantities, so choosing the correct measuring device with the appropriate units is important. If you only have access to a meter and a ruler, what would be appropriate for the following questions? So, just having a meter stick or ruler, what would we use for this scenario? So what would you use to measure the height of a chair attached to your desk? We would probably want to use a meter stick there, right? And we can measure in either meters or centimeters. Okay, how about this one? What would you use to measure the length of a paperclip? you're right. We'd probably use a ruler, right? And we're going to use it in centimeters. Notice how we are not using inches. Inches is not in the metric system. Never, ever, ever in science classes are we ever going to use inches or any kind of English measurement. So no feet, no yards, no nothing. Okay, it's all metric system. So meters or centimeters. Okay, what would we use to measure the thickness of our fingernail? Definitely a ruler, right? And we're probably going to use the millimeters side. Okay, that would be on the same side as the metric system with centimeters and meters, but we're going to use millimeters there because the thickness of our fingernail is not very thick. Okay, and then lastly, what would we use to measure the length of the lab counters in the back? Definitely a meter stick. Okay, so hopefully that was pretty easy for you. And what we're going to do is we're going to jump into dimensional analysis and the stair step in our next video.